Hello, I'm David Hackston and I translate novels from Finnish and Swedish into English, primarily Finnish, and it's for a Finnish translation that I've been nominated for the Lord Weidenfeld Prize for Literary Translation in 2020, and it's a great honour and I'm extremely grateful to have made it to the shortlist. So the book with which I'm on the shortlist is a novel called Crossing by a Finnish author called Paitim Statowski. And this is his second novel, and it was published in Finnish in 2016, published in English in 2019. And I've also translated his first novel, My Cat Yugoslavia, which came out in English in 2017. And his third novel, most recent novel, Bolla, which came out last year and won the Finlandia Prize for Literature here in Finland, and will be coming out in English in spring next year, that's 2021. So, to contextualise Crossing slightly, the novel follows two 14-year-old boys who live in Tirana, the capital city of Albania. They live next door to each other and they're great friends. And particularly due to the dysfunctional family relationships of the main narrator, Bujar, the two boys spend a great deal of time together. The first section of the novel is set during the period of 1990 to 1991, which was around the time of the fall of communism in Albania. This was a time of considerable political upheaval in the country, as it was elsewhere too, and the novel explores how that played out and how the boys experienced it. And it's these experiences that lay the background for their decision to run away in search of a better life in the West, which they imagine as a place of plenty, and a place where people can live as they want to, and crucially, where they can be who they want to. And this is an idea that will have great ramifications for events that occur as the novel progresses. The second thread in the novel takes place several years later, in the late 1990s and early 2000s. This section follows a second narrator, who is in fact Bujar, although at this point the reader isn't sure which of the two boys this second narrator actually is. This narrator travels from one European city to another, Madrid, Berlin, and finally ends up in New York City, always changing gender, changing city, and changing backstory as well. The final section of the novel sees this narrator arrive in Helsinki, Finland, where he begins a relationship with a trans woman and ends up, almost like Patricia Highsmith's talented Mr. Ripley, stealing her identity, ostensibly to enter a talent contest, but more to the point, to overcome his own sense of mediocrity, his shame regarding his past, and to make people, at least on a superficial level, think how interesting he is. Now, these two narratives, the two boys in Tirana and the Virginia Woolf-esque Orlando figure, assuming different personae around the world, are then juxtaposed with extended examples of Albanian folklore and fairy tales, often recollections of the stories Bujar's father told him as a child, and these stories can really be considered a third narrative strand throughout the book. Good morning. So let me say a few words about the title of the novel. This is interesting from a translation point of view, not least because it's not actually a translation of the original title. So in the original, the book is called Tiranan Sudan, literally Heart of Tirana or The Heart of Tirana. Now, because as we know, every translation represents an individual translator's personal reading of the original. Perhaps another translator might not have found this title problematic in the slightest, but for me the title Heart of Tirana strongly invokes Conrad's Heart of Darkness, and this is an association that I believe Statowski isn't making in the original at all. So at least for me it was clear from quite an early stage that the book might well need a new title in English. So my initial working title was A Tirana Odyssey, or Tirana: an Odyssey. And though the word Odyssey works well for many of the themes in the book, the literal sea crossing and the character's personal odyssey, and indeed the odyssey of Albanian history and folklore laid out in Bujar's father's stories, perhaps the title grounds the book far too much in Tirana itself, whereas the heart of the original title could also be understood as referring to the characters, a dimension lost in a title such as A Tirana Odyssey. Another reason I was keen to keep Tirana in the title was to associate the book with its predecessor, My Cat Yugoslavia, a book that, though somewhat more obliquely, deals with the separation of the former Yugoslavia and Kosovan Albanian history in general. Another preoccupation of mine was that My Cat Yugoslavia is such an arresting title that the title of this new book has to be every bit as alluring. As a title, My Cat Yugoslavia is quite a hard act to follow. So we had a variety of working titles for Crossing before going to print. Maybe the problem of a short, pithy title like this is that it's hard to encompass every aspect of a book, especially one as sweeping as Crossing. The author at some point suggested heartlines, though for my taste this perhaps focuses too much on the interrelationships of the characters at the expense of the historical aspects, whereas my own suggestion, All My Father's Stories, does actually the opposite by focusing too much on the historical and folkloric sides of the novel, and not enough perhaps on the characters and their development. So eventually it was the book's American publisher Tim O'Connell at Pantheon who suggested Crossing as a title for the book. My only initial reservation was that it is quite a short title. It's only one word, only 2 syllables. But the more I read through the manuscript with this title in mind, the more I came to think it suited the text quite perfectly, actually. This is a book of many, many crossings, in many respects. So, as in any novel, though perhaps more so in a novel like this that shifts around in time and history, it's important to find the right tone in the prose, a voice appropriate for each place and each era. As I see it, the writing in Crossing can be divided into 3 distinct styles. There is what we might call neutral prose, though as a caveat, by neutral I don't mean bland at all, because nothing in Statovski's writing is ever bland. I just mean that the writing isn't necessarily marked in any particular way. And I also consider the dialogue a part of this category as well. So most of the novel is written in this style, whether it's describing locations or following the boys' lives as they eke out an existence in the beach resort of Durrës. Then there is what we might call rhapsodic prose, and from a translation point of view, this is where things start to get interesting. Rhapsodic prose is something common to all 3 of Statovski's novels, and next spring, when Bolla is published in English, you'll be able to see this style of prose taken to quite an extreme, as in that novel one of the 2 protagonists writes, for reasons that I won't spoil right now, almost exclusively in this style, so much so that half the time the writing verges on poetry. It's really quite wonderful and lucid. Now, lucid is a very good word to describe the style in Crossing too. At times it can be like a Joycean stream of consciousness, whereby the narrator Bujar latches onto an idea and, as it were, riffs on it, taking a single image and extrapolating it further and further. There's a powerful rhythmic feel to these sections, partly due to the deliberate repetition of a particular word or phrase, and this lends these sections an almost breathless quality when you read them aloud, or even when you read them to yourself. So a good example of this style is at the end of the chapter called The Funeral, and if you have Crossing to hand, it's on pages 60 to 61, and if you have the original and want to consult that too, it's on pages 65 to 66. Now I'll read these 2 sections and try to give the rhythm and cadence of the paragraph in question as best I can. Olimme valtavan väsyneitä. Emmekä jaksaneet juurikaan puhua kotimatkan aikana. Äitini kysyi, miten minulla meni sedän kanssa. Hyvin, vastasin ohimalkaisesti ja painoin otsani bussin ikkunaan. Enkä ollut koskaan nähnyt yhtä pimeää yötä. Mietin traktorimatkaa ja haudan lautoja. Mietin, miltä elämämme tästä hetkestä lähtien näyttäisi, Miten pitkään äitini eläisi, sairastuisiko hän yhtä pahasti, ja miten pitkään minun pitäisi pitää hänestä huolta. Mietin, löytäisikö Ana itselleen koskaan miestä, ja kuka varmistaisi, että mies on kunnollinen. Mietin, mistä löytäisin itselleni työtä, ja mietin, miltä kuolema tuntuu. Onko se kuin nukkuisi ja näkisi jatkuvasti unta, vai jotakin ihan muuta. Ja äkkiä olin raivoissani isälleni. Tappaisin hänet omin käsin, jos hän olisi vielä elossa. Niin minä ajattelin, ja sitten itkin. Ja toivoin bussin kellahtavan kumoon ja vierivän vuorten suuhun, kuin ikkunasta ulos heitetty tupakan tuppi. So that was the Finnish original, and now here is the same section in my own translation. We were extraordinarily tired, and didn't have the strength to talk to one another on the journey home. My mother asked how things had gone with my uncle. Fine, I said offhand, resting my forehead against the bus window. And I don't think I'd ever seen a night as dark as this. I thought about the tractor journey, the planks in the grave. I thought about what our lives would look like from this moment onward, how long my mother would live, whether she would become ill like my father, and how long I'd have to look after her. I thought about Anna, wondered whether she'd ever find a husband, and who would decide whether the man was upstanding enough. I thought about where I could find a job, and I thought about what death must feel like. Is it like falling asleep, like dreaming an endless dream, or something else altogether? And all of a sudden I was so angry at my father that I could have killed him with my bare hands if he'd still been alive. That's what I thought, and then I began to cry, and wished for the bus to topple over and roll into the gaping mouth of the ravine, like a cigarette end thrown from the window. So, as I said, I think the paragraph we just looked at is an example of what I might call rhapsodic prose. And in that, there is a very strong rhythmic character that the author has created, largely through repetition and through the deployment of alliterative tools, notably with the letter M in the Finnish. Mietin, I thought. Miltä, miten, I thought what, or how something would be done. And then in the section about his sister Anna, even the word mies, man, is also used to punctuate this very long sentence that begins from the section Mietin traktorimatkaa, which then is one sentence right until the end of the paragraph. So in English that's from the section I thought about the tractor journey. So obviously when translating alliteration, words that begin with the same letter in Finnish don't necessarily all begin with the same letter in another language, and that is also the case in English as well. The words mietin, mies, miltä, miten don't all begin with the word M. So we have to find another way of creating the rhythm in this paragraph because it's one of the key stylistic elements used by the author in this place. So one of the ways I've attempted to do it in this paragraph is through repetition of the words I thought, mietin, and also by using tension and release in the sentence structure. So we have the first sentence is a short clause followed by another short clause, then a longer clause and another longer clause, so it's a more relaxed sentence. Then after another long clause followed by long clause, there's then short and then immediately another short one. So using the different lengths of clauses, we can create a sense of impetus, a sense of motion towards the end of this very long sentence. So it operates in a very musical way, in fact, if we look at the words I thought. I thought about the tractor journey, the planks and the grave. I thought about what our lives would look like from this moment onwards, how long my mother would live, whether she might become ill like my father, and how long I'd have to look after her. I thought about Anna, wondered whether she'd ever find a husband, and who would decide whether the man was upstanding enough. I thought about where I could find a job, and I thought about what death must feel like. Is it like falling asleep, like dreaming an endless dream, or something else altogether? So this is just one example of how we can use musical elements almost to reinforce the prosody of the entire sentence, especially when sentences are as long as this one. and in places where we can't directly render the alliteration of the original text. And finally, which we haven't spoken about yet, is the third distinct style in this novel, which is the fairy tale style, I will call it for the purposes of this video. And that is the style that Statovsky uses in all of the stories that Buyar's father tells him along through the course of the novel. And I think you could do an entire video about this style because it's very intricate, and I think the translator has to really think about how to render these fairy tales, because there is a childlike element to them, although they're very fantastical, they're very brutal. So the translator really has to perform something of a balancing act between, on the one hand, rendering the beauty of these fairy tales, while at the same time conveying the brutality of their subject matter, and yet all the time bearing in mind an assumed child listener and the innocence of so many of the characters in these stories, which is a style common to many folk traditions from across Europe and the world. But as I say, this would most definitely be the subject of much greater investigation, far in greater detail than we can go into in this video today. Well, I hope this video gives you an interesting window into Crossing if you haven't already read it. If you have read it, then perhaps you have some of your own thoughts on the different stylistic devices that I've used in the translation. And if you read Finnish, it might also be interesting to compare the two. They're very similar, but also very different. There was a good review in the Asymptote online journal by a critic called Jenny Ruobak, who went into some considerable detail comparing the Finnish with the English, and I was really grateful that someone had taken the trouble to do that, because it's so rare that a reviewer looks at the original in comparison to the translation in such detail. And now all that remains is for me to thank everybody at the Oxford Weidenfeld Prize, at Pantheon in New York, and Pushkin Press in London, and of course Paitim Statovsky himself, for everything they've done to bring Crossing into the world in English and make it such a great success. So I hope you have enjoyed this video, and I hope you'll enjoy reading Bolla when it comes out in English next spring, every bit as much as you've enjoyed the previous two novels. Thank you.